Well, let's bring it back into the studio with March for Justice advisor Hanan, Ibrahim and Melanie Eagle. Hanan and Melanie, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you both here. Melanie, we'll be with you first. You've been a leader in the local government as the youngest female mayor of St Kilda and the inaugural chair of Respect Victoria, and have been active in women's issues for many, many years. Do you think we are seeing a new interest in feminism and gender equality?
Thank you. I think I've experienced it in waves. So if you go back, as you say, to local government decades ago, because when you're as old as me, it's literally decades ago. And still then it was a shock to the senior male town clerk and city engineer to have a young woman say, well, it's not going to be chairman anymore, it's just going to be chair, and how about we have a diversity committee, etc. And then, you know, perhaps a decade later, I was working at the Equal Opportunity Commission at the first Systemic Initiatives Officer. Now, I'm not saying this is about me, but these are illustrations of waves of change. Subsequent to that, there was work in Victoria with earlier reforms about family violence and sexual assault that led to changes in the court system and police response. And I was a bit part of that, along with others. And most recently, we saw the Royal Commission into Family Violence, and that led to Respect Victoria, which I was the first chair of. And we've seen the new gender equality legislation in Victoria. So there's been waves. And all of these built upon the earlier work that's gone around the globe for generations, really, of people fighting.
So true.
But tragically, we're seeing that people are still having to assert themselves, and those voices are seen as, you know, querulous and too demanding, just asking for equality when that should already be there.
Yeah. So you mentioned frustration, and you've been seeing what is coming through on the live feed. We are having some technical difficulties, but we're getting some of it, so please bear with us. It's a different March for Justice this year without the focus on Parliament House in Canberra, spread out and diverse. What do you think is the means for this year and into the future?
Of course, it doesn't help when you have floods and, you know, other tragic events, you know, northern part. And we've seen in Melbourne our capacity to be able to get people out, which is inspiring still. I think there's a degree of kind of entrenched frustration, and how do we give voice to that, and is it digitally, will it be in the ballot box in just a few months' time? Because I think no matter what happens at the elections, this frustration's not going to go away, and people are really expecting change. There's been solid reports that are referenced on our website, and clear asks, and there's sound logic behind what should be occurring, and people are pretty committed to it having to change.
For sure. Now, Hanan, bringing you into the discussion now, you're a trailblazer yourself, the first Muslim woman in a hijab signed to an agency in Australia. But I also want to acknowledge that you're a healthcare worker. You've worked with cancer patients as a radiotherapist, so you know firsthand the impact that the pandemic has been for mostly women working in the work of healthcare. So I want to ask you about that. You were in Melbourne during the long lockdowns, and there's been a lot of talk about the additional burden on women who've shouldered from the pandemic, the work that we've shouldered from the pandemic. What do you think the pandemic has shown us about women's role in Australian society?
That women are overworked and undervalued, but we've already known this. I think what the pandemic taught us is that the systems that are upheld in our society have failed us. Inequality, misogyny, Islamophobia, racism, classism, elitism, all of these things existed before COVID. The pandemic exacerbated it to the point where we couldn't ignore it anymore. You know, millions of people all over the world were protesting on the streets in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, which works to help and liberate our most vulnerable communities. You know, Black and Indigenous women low-income earners, migrant and refugee women were hit the most. They were affected heavily. So many lost their jobs. They were left fending for themselves and were isolated from communities that, you know, we've relied on to get us through most chaos. It's really unfortunate. Domestic violence shelters, who were already overwhelmed pre-COVID, were at capacity, and I think not enough is being done to combat these issues.
Not enough at all. And Hanan, one of the things about this year is that young women are as fired up as their elder sisters were before them. 100 years ago, got the right to vote in Australia. Well, women got the right to vote. 50 years ago, they didn't have to resign from the public service when they got married. What do you think we will achieve in the next 50 years?
In the next 50 years, I just hope that we can live in a world where there is no domination, where people can just be free to live as who they are and be celebrated in that. You know, a world where we're actually focused on the things that matter, like, you know, we've destroyed the earth. I want us to come together to combat climate crisis. And for me, most importantly, I want a world where women and girls are free from abuse in all its forms.
My head nearly shook off my shoulders there. Hannah talked about racism towards Aboriginal women, and you've been quite outspoken about lack of diversity representation in the discussions on gender and equality, with not enough representation of women from different backgrounds. How do you think we can change that?
You know, I get this question so often, and so much can be done. You know, pass the mic and bring more seats to the table and take into account the different identities and the backgrounds of people who want to be seen and heard and their experiences validated and acknowledged in a way that is actually inclusive and not tokenistic. You know, having one woman of colour represent an entire group of Black, Indigenous, people of colour just isn't working for us. To put women of colour in positions of power where their needs are actually listened to without the prejudice and the bias that is constantly pushed upon us without us asking for it.
So much in there. Thank you both for your time today. It was wonderful having you both here and sharing your knowledge. Thank you. Thank you.